Chapter 17, Real Estate Leases. We know that a real estate lease is a contract. A contract is legally binding on both parties. So this is a legally binding contract on the landlord and the tenant. Here we have some terms that go along with leases. The first one is a lessee, that's the tenant. And then we have the lessor, which is the owner or the landlord. A leased fee estate, that is the landlord's interest or the landlord's estate in the property that they're leasing to someone else. Now remember, the word fee means ownership. So if you say a leased fee, we are referring to the landlord's estate. We also have a leasehold estate. Remember, the tenant holds the lease. So this is the tenant's rights that are associated when they are granted a lease on a property. The last term here is reversion. This is the right that the owner has to retake the property once your lease period has expired. Here we have different estate periods. Now we've talked about these a little bit in a previous chapter, so I'm just going to go over them briefly here. The first one is an estate for years. Now remember, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's for a 1-year time frame. It could be for a 6-month time frame, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. But an estate for years has a beginning date and it has an ending date. We also have an estate at will. An estate at will can be terminated at any point by either party. We then have a periodic estate. This is going to be an estate that renews itself automatically. So a month-to-month lease, as long as you pay the rent for 1 month, it renews for the next month. So that's a really good example of a periodic estate. We also have a tenancy at sufferance. This is a holdover tenant. So this is someone who originally had a valid lease, and the lease has expired and they continue to stay in the property. They may or may not be paying rent. Now remember, a lease is a type of contract. In order for a contract to be valid, there are certain things that have to be present. A lease is exactly the same. So in order for a lease to be valid, we have to have the lessor and the lessee. We have to have a description of the premises. In most leases, if you're just using a street address, that is sufficient. You have to have an agreement to convey the property. The landlord is conveying it to the tenant, and the tenant is accepting possession on a specific date. The lease also has to tell you what the rent payment provisions are. So if you're paying $500 a month, at what point is it due? Is it due on the 1st? Is it late if you pay it after the 5th? Or is it late if you pay it after the 10th? What are the provisions of the rent payments? We need to know the beginning date of the lease and the ending date of the lease. So what is the duration of the lease? Is it a 3-month lease, 6-month lease, 1-year lease? What is it? And then we have to have the parties that are signing the lease. Here we have an example of a sample lease. And I'm just going to be quite frank with you here. Most leases are way longer than this, but like I said, just a sample. So here we have different types of rent. So the most common rent and the kind of rent that you're probably more familiar with is a gross lease or fixed rent. This is where you pay the same amount every single month. It's also referred to as a flat rent. We also have graduated rent. Graduated rent is where you have rent increases and they're at periodic terms. So they're predetermined. For instance, let's say you have a retail space that you're leasing for 5 years. The first year you pay $1,000 a month. The second year, your rent increases by 10%. The third year, it increases by 10%. The fourth year, it increases by 10%. So you have what we call a graduated or a step-up lease, where you're paying a little bit more every single year that you're in that lease. We also have percentage leases. This is where rent is a percentage of gross income. So you see this a lot in retail spaces and shopping malls. You have a flat rent that you pay for the space, and then whatever the amount of your sales that you report to your landlord are, once you reach a certain level, you then have to pay a percentage of your sales. So that is what we call a percentage lease. Now these can be written up lots of different ways. So you might see that it's a flat percentage of no matter what your sales are, or it might be that once you reach 10% of sales, then you have to pay a percentage to the landlord. So it just depends on where you are and what the lease says. So make sure you read it in detail. You also have a net lease. A net lease is where you're paying rent plus expenses. Okay, so in a net lease, typically you're going to have a rent amount that you pay, and then you're also going to have additional expenses that you're going to pay in addition to that. It could be taxes, it could be maintenance issue type things. Sometimes they call them community association management fees. They could go up each year. So there again, read the lease so that you know exactly what your responsibilities are. And then we have an index lease. This is where your rent is tied to an economic indicator. So depending on what the index is doing, your rent could go up or it could decrease. I have here some different types of lease terms. So we have options clause, assignment, subletting, ground leases, and then lease termination. And within lease termination, I'm going to talk about eviction and also constructive eviction. So let's look at each one of these. This is an option clause. It's also very often called a lease with an option to buy or an option to purchase. So an option clause is just that. It is an option. The option clause gives the tenant the right at a future time that's already predetermined to purchase the property that they have already negotiated a price for. So basically you're leasing a property maybe for a 1-year time frame, and at the end of that 1 year, then you have the option to go ahead and purchase the property at whatever the price was that you agreed to when you signed the lease. These are fairly common. I will say that in my experience, it's very rare that someone signs a lease with an option to purchase where they actually do buy the house. A lot of times what happens is you're like, yeah, I want to lease it, and then in a year I want to buy it because, and most of the times, the reason why they're doing a lease with an option to buy is because they can't qualify for the loan right now. So hopefully their credit will improve or they'll be making more money in a year from now. That may be the case and they may be able to qualify, but a lot of times what happens is when people move into a property, they live there for a few months and they realize they don't really like the house, or maybe they don't like the neighborhood, or maybe they don't like the area, or maybe they don't like their neighbors, or whatever it might be, and then they eventually don't. They lease it for the time frame, but then they don't actually buy. So just be cautious. I mean, what I would say here is don't count your chickens before they hatch. Don't be counting your commission until you actually receive that check. Now here we have two different terms that relate to one another, but you've probably only heard one of them. You've probably heard of subletting before, right? Where maybe you have an apartment that you're leasing and you need to get out of the lease, and so you sublease it to someone else. Now, when you sublease to someone, you are still ultimately responsible for that lease because your name is still on the lease, okay? So be very conscientious of that. The original tenant in a sublease is ultimately responsible if the person who is subleasing from the original tenant does not pay rent. Now, to be on the safer side, instead of doing a sublease, you can do what they call an assignment. This is where a total transfer of the leasee's rights are given to someone else. So say you're leasing an apartment, you need to get out of that lease. Instead of subleasing to someone, you can give an assignment to someone else. In a situation where you have an assignment, the person who is wanting to lease the apartment will go to the landlord, get qualified, and they will take your name off of the lease and replace it with the new person. So now, if the new person who has received the assignment stops paying rent, you are not responsible. Your name is no longer on the lease. Okay? So an assignment is way safer if you don't want to be ultimately responsible for the rent. Now this is a ground lease. This is where you're leasing land. So instead of purchasing the land to build a house or to build a business on, you're leasing the land, so the person who owns the land has cash flow coming in on the property. With a ground lease, typically they last anywhere from 25 to 99 years, which is kind of crazy to think about, right? The leasee pays for and owns the improvements that they add to the land, but they don't own the land. So a ground lease separates the ownership of the land from the ownership of the buildings that are on the land. It separates the ownership of the land from the improvement. Now, an interesting example that I heard about a ground lease is Guinness Brewery. For those of you who might like beer, they were founded in Dublin in 1759. Okay, so this is in Ireland. Originally, The brewery was on 4 acres that was leased. They leased it for £45 a year, and the original ground lease was for 9,000 years. How crazy is that? Okay. £45 is like $62.79. Okay. Now, since then, that was in 1759, Guinness has since bought the originally leased property and now they own it. But that's how it first started out. So I thought that was a really fun fact. Quiet enjoyment is one of the rights that tenants have whenever they lease property. Now, the right of quiet enjoyment is the right of possession and the use of property without any undue disturbance by others. This is the reason why if you're leasing a piece of property, the landlord has to give you notice if he's going to show up. Okay? So tenants are entitled to quiet enjoyment of the property, uninterrupted use of the property without interference from the owner, the property manager, or a third party without their prior knowledge. Let's talk about how you can terminate a lease. The first term here is actual eviction. So this is what you've heard of before. So this is that legal process where you're removing a tenant because they've breached the lease in some way. Now, most of the time, typical grounds for eviction are going to be non-payment. So they haven't paid rent. It could be that they're unlawfully using the property or they're not complying with health and safety codes. But the most common reason why people are evicted is because they stop paying you rent. Now, we also have constructive eviction. This is a little interesting because this is where a tenant can actually sue a landlord for damages because the landlord has defaulted on the lease agreement. Whenever a landlord signs a lease, they're promising that they are going to keep that property in a habitable condition, okay? Maintaining that the tenant can live in the house comfortably, okay? It has to be habitable. So if there's a certain situation where, I don't know, say it's August and the air conditioning breaks, okay? Now, in my opinion, this is my opinion, but in August, if you don't have air conditioning in South Georgia, that is inhabitable. So if the landlord will not fix the air conditioning, then you could technically sue for damages. Now, one of the things that makes the most sense would be, especially if the tenant wants to stay in the property, the tenant can actually make the repairs themselves at their own expense, and then they can deduct however much it was to make those repairs from the rent that is due. Now, keep in mind, you have to be really careful if you're going to do something like this because we have to document everything. If you're calling the landlord directly or if you're calling a property management company, make sure you document it every single time you call. If they still don't fix whatever it is that you want to fix, get 2 different estimates at least, submit those. If they still don't respond, at least you're documenting everything so that it's all on paper. Now let's talk a little bit about property management. So what is it exactly that property managers do? Property managers typically select the tenants that are going into specific units. They also collect security deposits, and if they do a really good job selecting tenants, they will also retain them for you. They collect rent. It depends on what type of management company it is. Sometimes it's an apartment complex, and so they have on-site management. They have an office in the complex itself. Sometimes it's going to be off-site management. Maybe it's a company that manages different apartments scattered all throughout town or different houses scattered throughout town. So it really just depends on what kind of management company you're affiliated with. When you're leasing a property, there are certain obligations that the landlord has to the tenant, and then there are certain obligations that the tenant has to the landlord. The landlord is obligated to make repairs on the property if there are issues that come up. The landlord has the right to inspect the property as long as they give notice. And the landlord has the right to enter the property, particularly if there's something that's going wrong. Now, the tenant's obligations are going to be preserve the property, make sure that you're not damaging the property, and then also pay rent. Now, the landlord can't just show up at any hour of the day and inspect his unit. They have to give notice. So reasonable notice would be anywhere from 12 to 24-hour lead time. I'm on the 24-hour lead time kind of side there. And then anywhere between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. Now, the landlord can enter the premises to make repairs, to inspect the unit. If the tenant is moving out, they can come in so that they can show the unit to someone else. Now, in the event of an emergency, obviously, a landlord is not going to have to give you 24 hours notice. So if there's a fire, if there's a water leak, maybe the security system's going off, there's storm damage, things like that, then that would be required emergency access, and the landlord can enter the property. For those of you who might be interested in property management, most property managers are real estate agents, not always, but a lot of times they are. But there are several different certifications that you can get as property managers. You can be a certified property manager, you can be a real property administrator, an accredited resident manager, or a systems maintenance administrator. So there's several different designations that you can get. So here are your key terms for Chapter 17.